In this lesson, we'll cover in-place families. So if you're wondering, you may ask, well, how many family types are there? In a previous lesson, we covered system families. Now we're talking about in-place families. Well, to answer that question, there are actually three types of families. System families, which are basically elements that belong to your systems, like your duct system, your piping system, conduit systems, that have a variety of different fittings attached to them, kind of like what you see on my screen now, that being a duct system. You also have loadable families. These are elements that can be loaded into your Revit project over and over, or different project to different project. And those could be anything, for example, such as the fitting here, the corner elbow that's rectangular or circular, or an architectural element like a chair or door or a window. Or it could be an annotation style, maybe a specific type of call out that you use. So those are all loadable families that can be reused in different projects. And then you have what this lesson is about, in-place families. Well, in-place families are for those unique elements that you just need to create something custom for this project. So it's not something you're going to use over and over again, or at least in theory, you're not going to use over and over again. So you create custom content. And the example of that is in-place families. Let's say on my screen, I have this ductwork and I need to create a custom piece of duct. Well, I could open up an existing family and modify it, duplicate it, and then create a new family, but then that goes back into my library and then I could use that over and over again. That may be what you want. Or you could create what's called an in-place family, basically just creating custom content, custom geometry, referencing this existing geometry you see on your screen, but it only exists for this exact Revit project. So how do we go about that? Well, first off, you would go to whatever tab for whatever you're designing. In this case, we're in Systems, so I'm going to go to the Systems tab, and then all the way over to the right to Component. Now, on the drop-down for Component, you have two options. You have the Place a Component, and just to show that, this is for those elements that already exist that you want to reuse within this project. So once I click Place a Component, you have the drop-down in Properties for the different components that I could place in that match up to this system that I'm placing, or something similar to it. Click Modify in the upper left to exit out of that. Go back to the Systems tab, go all the way to the right to the Component dropdown, and click Model in Place. Now, the first thing it's going to ask you, very similar to if you were creating a new family type, is, well, what family is this in-place model associated to? I'm going to say fitting, so I'll go down and select duct fittings. Go ahead and click OK. Now, the next box is going to ask me, well, what do you want to call this family? Now, you may say, well, where does this show up? Well, if you look at the lower left part of my screen in the browser, I scroll down to duct fittings. And below that, I have the actual names of the subfamilies, oval cross straight, oval elbow gourd, etc. This is the name that they're pertaining to. So whatever I create here will go in this list grouped under duct fittings. For example, in this one, I'm going to call it duct fittings sample. You can call it whatever you choose. Now, when you hit OK, you'll see it populate in your project browser. So go ahead and click OK. So I see it's now available in my project browser, but again, only for this project. The other thing that happens is the ribbon changes. You're now in the editing mode, very similar to what you would see if you were creating a family file or editing a family file. So from this point, what you technically would do is you would create some geometry if the geometry didn't exist, and then add some intelligence to it if you wanted to. For example, a duct connector or a conduit connector for actually placing this if you were going to use this connect within the system. Also, if you wanted it to be able to measure some of the elements within the system, airflow, for example. So I need to add those intelligent items into it. Now, to the right of the connectors are datums. This is what I would use if I'm setting up references. So what plane do you want to sketch on? Not on the floor, not on ceiling, but maybe at a certain distance off the finished floor. Or reference lines, dimensioning from A to B or C to D. An example of how to do this without going in depth, because creating family files can be a pretty elaborate task, especially if you're adding in a lot of the content, and we're not focusing on that just yet within this lesson. A quick example to show you this would be I want to create an extrusion, basically some three-dimensional geometry. I'll go to the Forms part of the ribbon. I'll click Extrusion. That will now change to the Drawing Edit mode, and over on the right, I'm going to select Basic Line. This will allow me to basically draw lines, similar to sketching. And then I'll use my existing geometry for the ductwork simply by starting to select different points and then drawing some rough geometry for the shape of this duct. The geometry really doesn't matter for this example. So once you've created some geometry, make sure it's closed in this case so all the corners are touching each other, no overlapping lines. Go ahead and click the green check mark. That will then exit out of the edit mode, and you're now basically able to edit this, add some other additional settings, or if you're finished with it, I could say finish model. That will then create the geometry, this new duct element. I see it now in the project browser in the subheading, and this is where I can go in and further edit that, assigning it to a family, specific values to it, conduit elements, and intelligence, if you will. So in summary, this lesson covered in-place families. What are they? Where do you use them? And how do you go about creating an in-place family?